UK on its own has a lot to think about, but also a lot of opportunities going both ways, and especially vis-a-vis Thailand. Kun Kavi mentioned Chonfest. This is the Southeast Asian nuclear weapons free zone. The idea of maintaining regional autonomy and keeping the nuclear powers from interfering. So perhaps the UK now has a chance, with Brexit, to accede to the TAC, Chonfest. We can do all kinds of things that it could not do when it was hemmed in by the EU structure. We have a little bit of time for audience participation, engagement for the next 15 minutes. The floor is open. I invite and encourage questions, comments from our audience. Starting with Kun Panya first. Please keep it short and we can take a round. Yeah.
Since it's going to be a drawn-out process, it can last as long as 6 years, as Professor Kelly said. Thanks so much for the insight, so that we can follow the development for the next 6 years. And thank you, UK, for making a sacrifice so that the EU get a wake-up call and improve the process better for the peace and prosperity of the world. You mentioned about education. So my first question is about education. Is it fair and legitimate to ask people on this very complex issue that make major decisions for the country? That's first question, the legitimacy, whether it's constructive, productive, and actually legitimate to do so. And second, because of education, it gives politicians to get to the less educated people. It can mislead, trigger anger, hatred, and eventually even outright lie on the campaign. So the second question is whether this is legal offense for campaigning this way.
Yeah.
Third question is about in other democratic society, we don't make decision of this important magnitude on 48-52. So what is your take on the legitimacy of not having a supermajority to make a very important decision like this? Thank you.
So thank you for the invitation today. I think it was a very good call to invite a distinguished academic to attend today, because he could speak with a lot more freedom than any British government official at the moment, because there are lots of issues, lots of questions and no real answers. My own personal experience, I was home for the referendum. I voted Remain, so I'm one of the 48%. But the town where I live in the northwest of England voted 67% to leave, and my mother was one of them. So we had that classic tension within the family. It was the first time in my life that I'd felt stunned by a political event in our country. I felt resentful. But after 2 or 3 days, I realised, hey, you've got to respect the view of the majority, and we've got to move forward. And as a country, we will move forward. We've got a lot to be positive about at UN, NATO, international aid, trade, place to do business. So we will get on with it, and we'll make something good of this. And I'd add that some high-level meetings we've had this week, the tone is very much from our Thai friends that this can be good for the UK. So we'll get on with it, and we'll turn it into something positive. And finally, I would just say that I would absolutely agree and endorse Simon's views on our bilateral relations and prospects for those relations. Thank you.
I'm Tete from Bangkok University International College, lecturer for international relations. And may I ask that PTT can be the rival of EU, and it can also weaken the ASEAN free trade and counterbalance China, because 4 ASEAN members are already in the PTT members of the 12 countries. So it can be another rising star, another bloc to make it ASEAN to be a little bit of ASEAN free trade to be split and counterbalance China and become the rivals of EU. Is it a possibility or not?
Okay, thank you. TPP rivaling EU, and there's also that I think
We
called
can do
RCEP too. Okay, I think if there are no other hands, we will stop at that from the audience. I think we have time just for a round of responses from our speakers. Perhaps maybe we'll leave you for the last one, Professor
that's
Kelly.
fine, yes.
I think we maybe TPP to rival EU. It only has 4 ASEAN members: Brunei, Singapore, Malaysia, and Vietnam. Is it enough in size to rival the EU and to keep down China? And what about RCEP?
Well, RCEP has great difficulties because it has been discussed long time ago that it would be complete by the end of this year. Now, when ASEAN leaders met in Vientiane, they move on so that I think it would be complete maybe next year. But possibility, I don't know, because given the relation of China, the so-called CKJ, is not very well. Of course, it can rival TPP, and I think TPP now, without going through Congress, is left a lot of uncertainty. And some of the ASEAN members who have signed TPP, like Vietnam, is under pressures, during discussions to really try to blend in a little bit for ASEAN's benefit. For example, Vietnam is rather unusual because Vietnam has not yet been identified as a capitalist economy, but yet it has 17 FTA. Thailand is so capitalist but have only 7. So it tells you how strategic thinking in certain ASEAN countries really impact on the rest. I think it's still work in progress we see, but the potential is there. And I think RCEP will take longer now.
Okay. Thank you. There are some questions about education, and the idea of majority, minority, and then also how politicians could maybe mislead. Would you entertain some of those?
Thank you. I made one point. I think it's, as Simon from the embassy was saying, it was a shock that I think even to those who were pro-Brexit, most people were in a state of shock that a democratic system such as the UK's could lead to a result that was so unexpected. But it also seems to be a trend, and it's not just a trend in the UK, but it's a trend throughout the world. If we have a President Trump at the end of this year, I think that the question that Kun Banya asked, it becomes even more relevant. What is, I hesitate to say, but it comes back to a debate that has been raging around Thailand for many years, which is what is democracy, and is democracy an election where a majority say one thing and carry sway? Is that the measure of a democracy? So what do we mean by democracy? So I do think the results like this, first of all, they call into question the definition of democracy and how we should view it, and therefore legitimacy. But also, it's also a leveler in that we tend to see the UK as the home of democracy, or actually Greece, but UK the modern home, and America and Europe as the pillars of democratic societies. And part of that mythology is that they are a safe haven, that decisions will be made sensibly and respected and executed, rule of law, all that. Decisions like this call into question the idea of Europe and the West as a safe haven. And I'm in the property business, and one really interesting reflection of that I noticed the other day is in property yields. Because normally you would expect a safer country to have a lower yield, and that's generally been the case. But in recent years, that yield gap has narrowed, and the last transactions I've seen, for instance, here's a good example. In London, the what we call the prime office yield is around 4%. So if you buy an office building in London, you'll get a 4% dividend, basically. In Shanghai, it is also 4%. And that, to me, tells me not only that yields are being compressed around the world, but this idea of the West as a safe haven is being shattered as well. And the world is being leveled.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. I think you've touched on something that I think it's a global phenomenon as well. On the one hand, the European project is being challenged. But on the other hand, I think that you can also say that the global democracies, the democracy project around the world is being challenged as well, where you have, a majority, minority. There's always a close race. It's always a close outcome. Even Trump and Clinton, should be 80-20. It will end up being about 52-48, maybe 51-49. So, and then the simple majority rules for a number of years. In Thailand, we've seen this, and then at the expense of the minority, and then you have resentment and conflict and so on. So, something to think about. Democracies are also under challenge, not just European project. But on the European project, Ambassador Prügel, interesting what you said. I think now the challenge is, assuming that Brexit is going to unfold, it will happen, it will be realized. What happens to the EU? How can the European project stay on course, soldier on, and even improve in the coming years? Otherwise, we're seeing a ongoing loosening, fragmentation of the global system. The EU has been the foundation of the global order. If loosening, fragmentation besets the EU, then we have nothing left for global order.
I actually do not see the loosening of the EU. I think the EU 27 is staying together. And not only the EU 27, I think we mentioned it before, as long as the Brexit is not negotiated to the very end, Great Britain is a full member of the EU, and Great Britain is as such entirely participating in all the EU decisions and in the EU actions. Of course, especially on foreign security policy, one aspect, and there I wanted perhaps also shortly to come back to Mr. Kavi's mentioning the ASEAN. Mr. Kavi, the EU is coming next in 2 weeks' time. There will be around 10 foreign ministers and all the others represented by state secretaries, vice ministers, and of course this is prepared jointly by the EU, including Great Britain, and Great Britain is having a very active part in the preparation of this meeting and the intention to steer up our relations to a strategic relationship between the EU and ASEAN. But with regard to the stick together, perhaps to sum it up, I think the risk that we are running is indeed that we are having a too long transition where we will have a lot of debates within the EU, between the EU and Great Britain on different aspects. There will be a lot of speculation, and this insecurity during the process as such is of course damaging and is a problem and has its cost, as the Brexit as such of course has and will have an important economic cost. It will absorb a lot of all our energy, not only in the UK, also in all the other EU member countries. But this is a process we now have to face and have to go through. But I would turn it perhaps the other way around. There is also a positive aspect perhaps to it, and the positive aspect is that we are now obliged to reflect on a lot of things we have not been thinking about. I said it before, a lot of things that we have taken for granted. So we have to reflect about the necessary reforms within the EU. So this Brexit will actually, or might actually have been welcome wake-up call that will in the end not weaken but strengthen the EU.
Just quickly, are you concerned about other countries following the Brexit example, and also the resurgent parties from the right, the anti-immigration parties in certain countries like the Netherlands and even in Germany and so on?
I think these are two different issues. I think one is the question whether other countries might follow the example. There was a lot of speculation before. All this speculation has died down after the Brexit. I do not see that in any countries there is a serious tendency to go for a similar exercise. On the other side, a completely different question is, of course, populist right-wing movements we are having, especially as a reaction to the migration issue, to the refugee issue in various countries in the EU, including the Alternative for Germany in my own country that succeeded concerning results in the last regional elections. I think this is the reason why we have to come to a common policy dealing with these issues. This is, of course, this is a serious threat of this populist movement. But populism is a very general threat, I think, throughout the world. We have seen it in various countries where elections produce results we would never have been believed possible or expected. But this perhaps also brings us back to the issue of democracy and of referendum. We in Germany have, with our experience in the Weimar Republic and with the Nazi regime as a result of it, have made a very specific experience with that. We have drawn our conclusions in the German constitutions. There's very few possibility for a referendum. Referenda in our constitution almost does not exist because as a result of our history, we have built in as much as possible checks and balances within the constitution based on the principle of a representative democracy and limiting very much the elements of direct democracy, what is a referendum. And this is certainly something that, especially in today's world, with the role that social media are having, that changes the functioning of democracy, changes the perception where you get very quickly to a huge electorate with very simple slogans and where everybody can spray out into the world whatever he thinks it can be as stupid as possible, but there is no consequence. Because I think we have a problem with today with the social media. Functioning of democracy has actually changed.
Thank you very much. Quick last word from you, Professor Kelly, to any of the comments and questions that have been raised.
Okay. Let me, a quick observation to Mr. Kavi and to Simon from the Embassy. I mean, you raised the number of opportunities for the UK in the region and with Thailand, and we should get on with it and so on. So, I mean, you will be aware that, of course, there's a capacity issue here, that suddenly becoming responsible for activities that we have shared with the EU does put enormous pressure on people like yourselves. You know, do we have the volume of trade negotiators that we actually need? Actually, no, we don't. And in the university sector, you know, the government has started to engage with LSE, with a number of other leading universities to see where they can help in terms of training up capacity, secondments where that's appropriate. It's one thing to say there's this world of opportunity out there, go for it. But as, you know, people who are involved in the business of foreign service, trade negotiation and so on, you have people who have to do this, and that's a big change and something that cannot be done quickly. So opportunities, certainly, what we do about them, that's less straightforward. And that's where the Brexit process is a challenge. The thing I wanted to comment on most was the excellent question about education, about referenda, and about the democratic process. And in a way, I want to follow up on what the ambassador said. I have a very good friend who I studied with in London, who is a leading professor of political science in China, Li Chang, who came to LSE in the 1980s, one of the first to be allowed to study in the UK political theory, political philosophy, controversial subject and so on. He is a great student of, an advocate of democratic transformation in China. But he's also a student of Carl Schmitt, didn't study with, but a scholar of Carl Schmitt, Max Weber, and the English theorists of representative government in the 19th century. And precisely this question of how could we allow, in light of 20th century European experience, people who've thought about this, such a major issue to be decided in this particular way. How could you do that? Surely you know that is not how democratic thinking goes. And that takes us back to, I think, a fundamental challenge that we face in terms of understanding what democracy is and what populism is. We face claims for democratic decisions and democratic voice, but we should remember, if you go back to the founding sort of texts of the Western political tradition, Thucydides, History of the Peloponnesian War, it is the story of how democracy undermines itself. For 2,500 years in the West, democracy was considered the worst form of government. It was only in the 19th century that representation was brought in, where the democratic element was incorporated into stable political systems that do precisely the things that Ambassador Prügel has talked about, and which Germany wrestled with in the 20th century. The way in which political elites are able to hear from the people but manage the concerns of the people without constantly asking a people what do they think. Because if you do opinion research, you will find that the people think a lot of different things all at the same time. If you look at the referendum result, 52% on a 76% turnout. That is roughly 36% of the relevant electorate have decided to leave on the basis of what? If you look at people's preference orderings in the United Kingdom, there are about 35% of the population who are hostile to immigration. Full stop. That is their most important concern, and they don't like the European Union. There is about 30% on the other side, people like myself, who think globalization is fantastic, cosmopolitanism is the way forward, free movement, and so on. And they're sort of irreconcilables on that side of the debate. And then the remainder, 50% roughly in the middle, are willing to be persuaded about the benefits of things. And most democratic elections, most elections in the UK, are about that middle group who are generally open to the debate. So most people's preference ordering puts the economy, family security and so on high up, and then it gets specific as you go down their preference ordering. People like myself, rank things like university funding quite highly because I'm a professor at a university. Average British electors probably don't put higher education funding very high in their list of things. So, representative elections allow, if you like, the political parties and the elite selection process of government to filter those decisions with manifestos, with ranges of opportunities and so on. If you ask people a straightforward question, you will get a straightforward answer. But you're not asking them to say, and how highly do you rank this in all the other things you want? So to go back to Simon's point, the British people have told us something, but they haven't told us how important the actual outcome really is. They would like to be separate from the European Union, but not at what cost, not at what rights they will be giving up. And I think this is where the issue of intergenerational justice or intergenerational voice matters. And it comes back to your very important question about education. The key point I was trying to make with the slide about education was not to say that those who vote for leaving the EU were stupid, less informed than others. But education, tracks mobility, it tracks the kinds of things that allow people to benefit from globalization. The educated people like my own children are people who actually think that, being excluded from the possibility of working in Europe is a constraint. in a way that that wouldn't have been an issue for perhaps my parents' generation. It just wouldn't have occurred to them that they could work in Germany or Italy or Poland or Hungary or expect those people to be working alongside them. So it's that issue about how globalization and the opportunities of globalization impact, which is the key issue of education. But there is an important issue about education alongside that. The electorate in some respects expanded in the referendum, 76% turnout versus 66 roughly in the last general election. A lot of people who were not otherwise engaged in politics came to the referendum. And they came to the referendum for a very specific reason. And it appears that the Leave campaign were able to galvanize its 35% to vote. Whereas, you know, the young and the educated and so on, they're busy. They're doing the things that globalization and so on bring. But those who were against turned out to vote in protest. So that is why referenda are bad things. Actually, in our system, they can only be advisory. But once you've asked people, you can't ignore what they say. You know, we've asked them, you're quite right, Brexit means Brexit, we have to take that on board. Now you've been asked, we have to deal with it. But what have we asked them? We asked them a very simple question. We didn't give them an option. We've left open precisely the possibility of manipulation that populist single-issue votes allow. And that, I think, goes back to the heart of this question about where education comes in and what democracy really is. You know, we've learnt a lot in the 20th century, we've learnt a lot in the early part of the 21st century. That democracy is a much more complex thing than simply allowing people to say what comes into their head at the time they're asked. It does mean some processes that manage people not telling what in some cases were just outright lies, things that are clearly not the case. You know, the issue that in some sense is coming out in the Clinton-Trump election, where somebody can just get up and say things that are untrue, and people can easily check that they're untrue, but they are just left as part of normal debate. We need a process. We have developed processes, sophisticated processes in Western democracies to try and manage that, but we have lost some confidence in their ability to do that political work for us. So there is a big lesson here which goes to the issue of globalization about trust in political processes. And I think that is something that is a global challenge. And the answers and the ways of dealing with that are very problematic. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Paul. That was erudite, very good, and I think we can go on for a long time. Some of the speakers have lunch engagement, so I just want to bring this to a close very quickly. We don't like to have negative or zero-sum outcomes in international affairs.
No.
So we like positive sums, win-win outcomes somehow. So to me, the UK does best under adversity. You know, and it has a lot of challenges. You know, the peak time is hour in World War II, for example. So I think that with Brexit, a lot of problems, a lot of challenges and risks. But in the end, we would hope that the UK would survive, persevere, and thrive. At the same time, we also want the EU to be able to regroup, reform, and continue to thrive. We don't want to see the UK leaving the EU at the expense of the EU. So win-win, we hope. Thanks very much for joining us. Please join me in thanking all the speakers, and thanks for coming today.